Chapter 5:18. Seeing the letter in the messenger's hand, King Piasai's handwritten letter, King Ladi only hesitated for a moment before deciding to lead his troops back to the country. Even though helping Jiaoji win the war was a great achievement, if the Lansang kingdom was severely damaged, all of his achievements would become a stain on his reputation. Worse still, the old dragon tribe would take this opportunity to make things difficult for him. General Ladi, who didn't want to give anyone a chance to criticize him, quickly ordered his troops to turn around and retreat. He didn't even inform Jiaoji. It was clear how anxious he was. Compared to the 20 miles a day they traveled on the way to Yinglu City, the speed of the army was much faster. After all, no one knew what would happen to the Lansang kingdom if they delayed for another day. Perhaps the mercenaries had already clashed with the kingdom's army. While General Ladi was leading his troops back, in a place called the Wuha Forest, mines were being watered by the summer rain. In the dense forest of the Wuha Forest, the troops of the 2nd Battalion commander of the 2nd Cold Front Regiment, Chen Bo, were hidden. 3 days ago, he led more than 10,000 soldiers to this place. After choosing this place as the ambush location, they began digging the mines intensively. In a short period of time, countless deep holes were dug on both sides of the road to place a total of 3,000 mines. In less than half a day, the mines were successfully placed. Next, everyone returned to their respective positions. Along the Wulin River, the 10,000 soldiers hid themselves and began a long wait. They brought with them 10 days' worth of rations, which mainly consisted of instant noodles, ham sausages, and various canned food. Every soldier was either eating or sleeping. It was a leisurely scene. However, as the commander, Chen Bo found it difficult to truly sleep soundly. From time to time, he would look into the distance to see if the scouts had sent back any new information. "It's raining." In the dense forest, someone called out softly. Then, Chen Bo raised his head and looked at the sky. What he saw was a drizzle falling from the sky. "Okay." Chen Bo couldn't help but clench his fists in excitement as he watched the drizzle fall on the trees and drip onto himself. Previously, he was still worried that he would leave some traces behind when he buried the mines and be discovered by others. But now that the rain was falling from the sky, everything was no longer a problem. This would be the best cover. In such weather, even the best scout would find it difficult to discover any problems. Not long after the light rain fell, a figure in the distance was rapidly approaching the dense forest. The person who came was the scout that was sent out. With his return, he also brought the latest news, which was that Ladi had returned with 100,000 troops. This damn weather. Riding on the horse and looking up at the sky, Ruthie couldn't help but curse. It was no wonder that Ladi was so angry. One could tell just by looking at the morale of the army. Originally, the nearly 100,000 soldiers were still holding their heads high and wanted to show off their might. But now, they were suddenly ordered to turn back. This was a very discouraging thing to begin with. But then it started to drizzle. Although it wasn't very heavy, after a long time, the soldiers' clothes were soaked. The sticky feeling was very uncomfortable. The road also became muddy with the continuous drizzle. Every step they took was heavier than usual. This feeling made them feel even more uncomfortable. The morale of the entire army became much lower because of this. From afar, the army that was walking with their heads lowered would curse from time to time. They all looked like they were blaming the heavens and blaming others. However, even though the morale of the army was low, General Ladi couldn't do anything. Under such weather and such orders, even if he was a great orator, he wouldn't be able to raise the morale of the army at this moment. He just hoped that they could quickly reach Yinglu City, enter the city, change into dry clothes, eat hot food, and have a good sleep. Perhaps they would feel much better after that. All troops, speed up and try to enter the city to rest at night. Thinking that they were less than 40 miles away from Yinglu City, Ladi made up his mind and gritted his teeth as he spoke to his subordinates. Soon, the order was passed down. Although they hadn't had a good rest since the beginning of the return journey, the soldiers didn't complain too much when they thought about how they could have a good sleep after entering the city. Instead, they sped up silently. At this moment, no one thought about whether they would encounter an ambush. After all, they didn't see a single enemy on the way here. Now that they were about to return to the city, They were only 40 miles away from Yinglu City. In addition, the weather was bad and the sky was gradually darkening. Who would attack them at this time? Just like how it was very strenuous for them to walk, wouldn't it be the same for the enemy who wanted to attack them? It was precisely because of this misconception that the nearly 100,000 troops didn't have the slightest awareness of being on guard. On the contrary, because of the rain, the distance between the front, middle, and rear of the army was increasing. The sky slowly darkened. Perhaps it was because of the rain, but the sky was much darker than usual. It also made people feel very vexed. However, all of this didn't affect the mercenaries much. They were originally hiding in the rainforest, and the trees above them had blocked much of the wind and rain for them. In addition, they had been sleeping the entire day apart from eating, so everyone was in good spirits. At this moment, this group of elite soldiers was staring at the approaching Longtime army. Even though the front of their army had already walked past them, not a single soldier had the intention to charge out and fight. Even the 10,000 Jiaoji mercenaries didn't dare to make a single sound under the strict orders of General Hong Jin. It was as if they were afraid of causing a commotion and angering the mercenaries who killed without batting an eyelid. Not to mention, before the battle, the mercenary battalion commander Chen Bo had said that as long as everyone followed the rules, after the battle was over, all the soldiers who participated in the battle would be rewarded with at least 20 taels of silver, regardless of whether they had contributed or not. 20 taels of silver was equivalent to the annual income of an ordinary family in Jiaoji. With such a reward in front of them, everyone was naturally as obedient as they could be. Naturally, only rich mercenaries would be able to casually pay out 200,000 taels of silver without feeling the slightest bit of heartache. The darkness continued. Half of the Longtime army had already passed through the Wuha forest, including the 5,000 cavalrymen and 5,000 archers. They were the main force and soul of this army of close to 100,000 men. Everyone, get ready. Through the night vision binoculars in his hands, he could clearly see the front of the army. He saw that the 5,000 cavalrymen were about to walk into a muddy area. In reality, there was a deep trench there. It was the best weapon to use against cavalrymen. As the commander, Chen Bo raised his right hand high into the air. Although the sky was a little dark, the raised right hand was still seen by many people. Their breathing became tense at this moment. Then, they focused their attention and waited for the hand to fall, then they would launch a fierce attack. The so-called attack was just shooting from a distance. According to Battalion Commander Chen Bo's plan, they could not fight the enemy head-on in this battle. They only needed to shoot from a short distance to cause chaos in the enemy army. Then, they would step on landmines to increase the chaos. As long as the enemy's morale was completely suppressed, then it would be time for them to clean up the mess. General Ati, who was unaware of all this, was still riding on his horse and moving forward. As a general, he arrogantly walked at the front. However, he did not know that his actions, which seemed like he was leading by example, was actually a catalyst to the death of nearly 100,000 soldiers. After all, if he, the main general, did not get into trouble immediately, the morale of the soldiers would not have fallen to the lowest point in such a short period of time. Bang! The trench, which was nearly 6 meters deep and 8 meters wide, collapsed. Before the cavalrymen in the first row could figure out what was going on, they fell one by one into the trench like dumplings. Next was the second row. General Ati was in this row. He only felt that the cavalryman in front of him had suddenly disappeared. Then, his body tilted and fell into the trench with a plop. Then it was the third row, the fourth row. Fortunately, the trench had a limited capacity. Otherwise, at least hundreds of cavalrymen would have fallen into the trench and lost their ability to fight. However, even if only a few hundred people fell into the trench, the consequences were considerable. This was because their commanding general and several captains beside him had fallen into the trench together. At this moment, they were still pressed down by the cavalrymen and horses that fell into the trench. It was impossible for them to move in a short period of time. Just as this chaos was about to break out, a dazzling light suddenly shot up into the sky. A very bright red signal flare streaked across the dark night sky. At this moment, the horn that signaled the beginning of the battle had been blown. Tut tut tut, bam bam bam, bam bam bam, gunshots rang out in all directions. Sparks from the muzzles suddenly appeared in all directions, dealing a fatal blow to the soldiers of the Lansong Kingdom who were in a hurry to move forward. No one would have thought that there would be enemies here. No one would have thought that they would be ambushed here. No one would have thought that the attack would be so sudden and fierce. Originally, the Wuha forest was on both sides of the road. The distance in a straight line was only about 500 meters. When all kinds of bullets flew over, and when people suddenly fell to the ground in the rainy night, the army was in chaos. Chapter 5:19. It seemed to be an instinct. When people encountered an emergency, their first thought was to run. If they had to describe it, they would have to add a word in front of the word run. Chaos. That's right, they were running around. Perhaps this was the only way they could feel at ease. As long as they kept moving, they would feel safer and know that they were still alive. However, they did not know that there were 3,000 landmines buried around them. Although the number was not considered a lot, it was much less than the 10,000 landmines that Yang Chundong buried in the Liangshan rainforest to deal with Ruan Yongyang. However, it was in the middle of the night, and under the sudden attack, when one of the 3,000 scattered landmines was stepped on, the shock it brought was also very strong. Boom, 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 boom. The explosions were incessant, flames were everywhere, blood was flowing everywhere, and corpses were scattered everywhere. When all these scenes appeared, it was like a purgatory on earth. Human lives became the most worthless existence. One of the captains who was lucky enough not to be affected by the war, under the premise that he could not find General Lati, acted like an ostrich under the protection of his bodyguards while he sent people to Yinglu City, which was 40 miles away, to ask for reinforcements. In terms of numbers, there were more soldiers here. However, anyone could see that under the sudden attack, their morale was low and their morale was low. There was no way they could win a battle with such an army. If reinforcements could appear, it might be like a cardiac stimulant, raising the morale of these soldiers and turning the situation around. Those who could become 10,000 men commanders were no fools. Thinking back to the news that they had received, the mercenaries had dispatched troops from the Long Mountain Range and headed to Xiu City to confront the Jiaoji Kingdom's army. It was unlikely that they would have many enemies after splitting up their forces. Perhaps, they still had a chance to turn the tables. However, what the major didn't know was that his actions weren't salvaging the situation. Instead, he was destroying the last bit of hope that he had. The war was still going on. Under the continuous drizzle, there were still many Lansong Kingdom soldiers who were hit and fell to the ground, losing their lives. From time to time, there would be people who stepped on landmines out of fear. Not only did they pay with their own lives, but they also caused their comrades to be sacrificed. In such a chaotic situation, it seemed that there were enemies everywhere, and nowhere was safe. Even the 5,000 so-called elite godly archers did not have the slightest bit of combat prowess in the face of such a situation. In the darkness, they could only see tongues of fire shooting out from all around them, but they couldn't see where the enemy was. Every time they wanted to walk over to take a look, bullets would shoot through their bodies before they could even get close, causing them to fall one by one. After a few more rounds, and after throwing down nearly 500 corpses, they became much more obedient. They no longer dared to recklessly probe anything. Instead, they changed from standing to lying down. This was because they discovered that once they did so, their safety was much more guaranteed. This was because the bullets from the muskets wouldn't take care of them. This discovery gave more of the Lansong Kingdom's soldiers hope of survival. Therefore, in less than an hour, all the soldiers who were still alive changed from standing to lying down. Because of this, the outside environment became much quieter than before. Unless there was someone who didn't have eyes and wanted to escape, only then would there be a few gunshots. Otherwise, it was very quiet most of the time. Although it wasn't good to lie down on the ground at this time, and many of them were even soaked by the rain and water, but compared to losing their lives, this was of course a very good result. Battalion commander, they are all lying down and not moving. Feeling that the swaying figures in their line of sight began to decrease until there were almost none, an officer reported to Chenbo, "Very good, isn't this what we want to see? Tell the soldiers, don't waste bullets. As long as they don't move, we won't move either. When dawn comes, it will be time to reap the fruits of victory. Now it's up to Chunyang and Sergeant Su." Chen Bo said calmly, but if one listened carefully, one could hear the sense of relief in his tone. Although the plan was very thorough, and they had set up an ambush here 3 days in advance. But before seeing the results, his heart had been hanging in the air. Now that there was finally a result, and it was a very good result, it was no wonder that his mood was much more relaxed. Yinglu City. As the temporary resting place of the Lansong Kingdom's reinforcements, this place was very safe. Even though General Ati had led the troops out, there were still 5,000 Lansong soldiers and 2,000 Jiaoji soldiers. A city with less than 40,000 permanent residents actually had 7,000 soldiers. This ratio was already very high. This made it so that the residents here were not too affected by the battle outside. Even if there was news that the Jiaoji Kingdom's capital had been taken over by the mercenary army, it was the same. This was because there was also news that King Lili was mobilizing a large number of troops to counterattack. Adding on the fact that 100,000 Lansong soldiers were stationed in this city, there was nothing to be afraid of. Not to mention that the mercenary army only had around 10,000 people. Since the residents were not afraid, the soldiers were even more so. Especially after General Ati led the 95,000-strong army to battle, the 7,000 soldiers who stayed behind to guard the city were living like the masters of the city. Other than closing the city gates to prevent accidents, they had been eating and sleeping for the past few days. Occasionally, they would gather together to gamble. Life was not too good. In actuality, the 5,000 people who stayed behind did not have much battle strength, and they were the weakest of the 100,000 people. As such, they did not have any military discipline. They all knew that the other soldiers had gone with the general to do meritorious deeds, and only they stayed behind. They were people who had been abandoned, and since it was like this, they decided to go all out. Adding on the fact that it had been raining for the past few days, they could drink some wine, sleep some well, and gamble some money. However, this good life was quickly disrupted. News came from the front lines that because the mercenary army had suddenly attacked the Lansong Kingdom, General Ati would no longer help the Jiaoji Kingdom and would instead go back to help his own kingdom. Moreover, he might return to the city today, so wouldn't their good days be over? Since the general was coming back, the soldiers put away their playful attitude, cleaned the barracks, and prepared food. For the entire day, the 5,000 people were very busy. Just when they were almost done with their preparations, a cavalryman suddenly arrived at the city gate with an unbelievable piece of news. General Ati and nearly 100,000 soldiers had been ambushed and suffered heavy losses. When the news came out, many people were in disbelief. If the cavalryman who came was not a Chiliarch, and he was indeed one of their own, some of the soldiers would have doubted the authenticity of this news. "Hurry up, the army is still fighting with the enemy, and we need your help now," the Chiliarch shouted at the top of the city gates. As if he was afraid that these people would delay the battle, he even shouted, "Weren't you guys regretting that you couldn't go with the army and get military merits? Now that the merits are in front of you, do you dare to fight for it?" The Chiliarch was still shouting, using his own method to provoke the 5,000 soldiers who stayed behind to guard the city. About 200 meters away from him, a few figures were lying on the ground, watching everything closely. Although it was still raining and the ground was already muddy, there were still mosquitoes flying around. Sometimes, there would even be some mosquitoes flying around in front of their faces, looking for opportunities to bite them from time to time. However, these black shadows just lay there motionless, like statues. To be able to not be affected by external factors, to have such iron discipline, who else could they be but the most elite soldiers of the Cold Vanguard Army? In fact, there were at least 200 of these black figures on the ground outside Yinglu City's East Gate. They were formed by the scouts of the 2nd Regiment and the 1st Company of the 2nd Battalion. They arrived when the sky turned dark. Under the cover of the rainy night, they crawled slowly to the city gates, and then found a good place to hide. At the place closest to the east gate, the few figures lying on the ground were the commanders of these 200 men. They were the Scouts' commander Su Yunxing and the 2nd Battalion's 1st Company's commander Chun Yang. The order they received was to take down Yinglu City and wipe out the 7,000 enemies in the city. Since Chen Bo had made a military order in front of Yang Chendong, saying that he was going to wipe out the 100,000 soldiers of the Lansong Kingdom, then the 5,000 Lansong soldiers guarding the city naturally had to be wiped out. Otherwise, wouldn't it be imperfect? However, the disparity between 200 and 7,000 was still a little too great. In order to complete this mission, Chen Bo gave the 2nd Battalion's 2 rocket launchers to the 1st Company's commander Chun Yang, as well as 2 squads machine guns. These were the treasures of the 2nd Battalion, and only the most elite Cold Vanguard army was given such good stuff. Now that they were all given to the 1st Company, this was the only thing that Chen Pai could support them in. When the 2 rocket launchers and 2 squads machine guns were in his hands, Chun Yang also made a military order in front of Chen Bo, guaranteeing that he would complete the mission. Speaking of which, the 200 of them only had to face the 2,000 Jiaoji soldiers in Yinglu City. With such firepower, this mission wasn't that hard to complete. At this moment, Company Commander Chunyang and Company Commander Su Yunxing were discussing the battle plan below the city gate tower. Chapter 520. Even though they were all company commanders, they seemed to be of the same rank. However, because Su Yunxing was a scout company commander directly under the regiment, his name was even registered with the 6th Young Master. In comparison, Chunyang, the company commander of the main force, was half a level lower. Because of this, Chunyang spoke in a negotiating tone. Company Commander Su, do you think we should first take control of the East Gate, then quickly take down the Jiaoji general's residence? I think so. After thinking for a moment, Su Yunxing nodded and added, I'll leave the East Gate and the general's residence to your company. I'll take the scout company to take control of the North, West, and South Gates. We'll try to take control of the entire city in the shortest amount of time. Chunyang was waiting for this sentence. He immediately said to Su Yunxing with a face full of gratitude, Thank you, Company Commander Su. AI, no need to be so polite. We're all completing our mission. Su Yunxing smiled and said in a low voice, The city gate is open. Yinglu City's east gate was indeed open. After this, Chiliarch arrived on horseback and explained the situation. The 5,000 Lansong soldiers in the city finally decided to come out and help. Speaking of which, they were all from the Lauting tribe. Many of the soldiers were related by blood. They definitely wouldn't leave their loved ones in danger. The 5,000-man troop was a long line in the darkness. From the moment they left the city to the moment they all walked out of the city, it took them more than an hour. When the last batch of Lansong soldiers walked out of the city gate, the dozen or so Jiaoji soldiers in charge of security prepared to close the city gate. However, these people had no idea that their lives had already begun the countdown. The moment they pushed the city gates with all their might, wanting to close them, over 10 black figures jumped out from behind them. It was as if they had appeared out of thin air. Then, a cold light flashed, and streams of blood gushed out. Then, over 10 people slowly fell to the ground. The scouts acted. They were already prepared and quickly took care of the Jiaoji soldiers who were trying to close the city gate. Then, 2 companies of elites rushed out of the east gate to the key locations in Yinglu City. No one would have thought that the mercenaries would attack Yinglu City in the middle of the night. Most of the 2,000 Jiaoji soldiers in the city had taken off their uniforms and were preparing to rest. But then, several gunshots rang out from outside. There's a situation. The gunshots startled the Jiaoji soldiers, and they hurriedly put on their clothes. Then, they grabbed their weapons and tried to rush out of the camp. Those who ran faster became the first batch of soldiers to walk out of the barracks. There were many figures in the dark. Then, torches were lit one after another. However, before they could illuminate the dark night, a series of rapid gunshots were heard. This was the sound of the squad's machine gun firing. This kind of gun that could fire 600 bullets in a minute was like a divine weapon in this era. Once he took it out, he would definitely be able to kill in all directions, and it would be difficult for him to find a worthy opponent. A series of gunshots rang out, and the first batch of Jiaoji soldiers fell into a pool of blood. Even when they were dying, they didn't understand what had happened. The dozens of Jiaoji soldiers who died were like role models, causing the other Jiaoji soldiers who wanted to rush out to stop. They were all frightened by the scene in front of them. This fear made them lose the courage to rush out of the camp, and they didn't even have the strength to light the torches. There were at least 1,500 Jiaoji soldiers in the camp. When they were scared into staying in the camp and didn't dare to come out, the matters outside were much easier to handle. Other than the 2 Lengfeng platoons who stayed outside the camp, Chang Chunyang led the remaining platoon of soldiers and charged into the general's residence. The gunshots outside caused the gates of the general's residence to be tightly shut from the inside. General Ying Lu's shouting could be heard from the inside. However, the tightly shut door was no different from a piece of paper in Leng Feng's eyes. He saw Captain Chunyang reach out and take the rocket launcher from a soldier. Then, with a loud bang, the tightly shut door was blown apart. The Jiaoji soldiers who were using their bodies to push against the door were sent flying. A few of them had already closed their eyes and stopped breathing while they were flying. Charge! After the door was blasted open, Chunyang pointed his hand forward and the valiant Cold Vanguard soldiers entered in a single file. A series of gunshots rang out, and in less than the time it took to drink a cup of tea, the general's residence was captured. Even General Ying Lu had become a corpse on the ground. If the general's residence was opened by brute force, then the Jiaoji soldiers on the western, southern, and northern city towers were beaten into submission by a roll call. To be able to become a scout, not only were they physically strong, their observation skills were also top-notch. Their training had taught them what it meant to protect themselves and attack the enemy at the same time. Therefore, they understood the value of life. When Company Commander Su Yunxing gave the order to the 3 platoons to attack freely, they actually chose the same method. They didn't attack the city towers, and only occupied the city gates. Not attacking the city towers meant that they didn't want to put themselves in danger. It could also be said that there was no need to take the risk. Their mission was only to control the 3 city gates. Since that was the case, they only needed to prevent the Jiaoji soldiers from coming down. Therefore, when they arrived at the city gates, the Jiaoji soldiers with torches became their targets. Every time a gunshot rang out, a figure would fall to the ground. After a dozen Jiaoji soldiers with torches were killed, the other Jiaoji soldiers learned their lesson. They extinguished the torches in their hands and found a corner to hide. The strength of the mercenaries had completely frightened them. At this moment, not to mention rushing down the city gates, they didn't even have the courage to stand up and check the situation. The 3 city gates fell into the hands of the scout company just like that. As the 4 city gates, the general's residence and the barracks were controlled, the Leng Feng platoons and the scout company had basically taken control of the entire Yinglu city. The 5,000 Lansong reinforcements who were completely unaware of all this were still rushing forward with all their might. As they got further and further away from Yinglu city, as they got closer and closer to the place where General Ati was ambushed, sporadic and light gunshots finally entered their ears. "Quick, it's right in front." The Chili Arch who reported the news pointed at the battlefield 2 to 3 li away and shouted loudly, "The enemy's reinforcements are here." In the dense forest, the 2nd Battalion Commander Chen Bo used his night vision binoculars and saw this scene. He then said to the messenger beside him, "Inform the 2nd Company to open up an opening and let these people in. Tell them they are allowed to enter but not leave. If one escapes, I will punish him." "Yes, Battalion Commander," the correspondent replied before turning around and running out. Not long after, the 2nd Company opened up an opening and the 5,000 Lansong soldiers charged into the encirclement. At the same time, they stepped into the gates of hell. Why is it so quiet? The moment they entered, the 5,000 reinforcements felt a sense of fear spread through their bodies. Logically speaking, there were close to 100,000 Lansong soldiers here. Even 100,000 pigs couldn't be killed in such a short amount of time. Furthermore, these were young and strong soldiers with their own thoughts. The moment this thought flashed through their minds, Reality told them the answer. Behind them, dense gunshots rang out from the left and right. The 5,000 reinforcements who became the target became the center of the battlefield at this moment, becoming the point where the bullets poured out. The original Lansong soldiers already had experience after many people died. That was, if they could sit, they definitely wouldn't stand. If they could lie down, they definitely wouldn't sit. Therefore, when 5,000 targets suddenly appeared on the battlefield, it was obvious what would happen. There was no need to aim too much. After all, the 5,000 people standing there were too obvious a target. The gunshots were already continuous. Extinguish the torches and lie down on the ground. The Chiliarch, who was lying on the ground like an ostrich, saw that at least a few hundred of his brothers had died in a very short amount of time. At the same time, he couldn't help but cry out loudly. Fortunately, his reaction was very fast. After getting up and shouting, he immediately lay down on the ground again. A bullet whistled past his head. He was so scared that his heartbeat quickened. He really didn't dare to imagine what would have happened if he had been a step slower. In the end, this shout was still effective. Some soldiers still heard it and threw away their torches and lay down on the ground. Although the bullets whistled past their heads from time to time, it was no longer a threat to their lives. The 5,000 reinforcements quietened down after a few hundred people died. The battlefield fell silent once more. At this moment, no one wanted to challenge or test anything. They all lay down on the ground obediently, allowing the rain to soak their bodies. Fortunately, it was only August and the night wasn't too cold. Otherwise, it would be really hard to imagine what would happen if they lay down like this for the entire night. Battalion commander, they have all become obedient. A soldier who was very close to Chenbo looked at the scene in front of him and said with a face full of excitement. Previously, when the soldiers of the 2nd Battalion knew that they had to deal with the 100,000 Lansong soldiers alone, it was impossible for them not to be nervous. Although it was true that they had the most advanced firearms in the world, the difference in numbers was still too great. Even with the assistance of 10,000 Jiaoji mercenaries, most of the soldiers still didn't have the confidence to kill the enemy. Chapter 521. Until now, seeing that the Lansong soldiers were scared out of their wits, their morale was completely gone. They were like obedient sheep lying on the ground without moving. Only then did they relax. The joy of victory also boosted the morale of the soldiers and increased their confidence. That's right, they've all become obedient. Chen Bo said with a satisfied expression. Although his plan was thorough and he was confident that he would obtain the final victory, before there was a result, any accidents could happen. Thinking about the military order he made in front of the 6th young master, it would be a lie to say that he wasn't worried at all. Fortunately, the heavens were on his side. This light rain came at the right time. Finally, the situation was settled. He could also give a satisfactory answer to the 6th young master. He was happy in his heart and a smile appeared on his face. How about this? Notify everyone to take turns to rest. Let everyone recover their energy. There will be a bigger test waiting for us at dawn. Right now, they were just surrounding these people. As for whether they could take them all down, there were still many things to be done. Of course, the next battle wasn't a big battle. As long as everything went according to plan, it was obvious what choice these 100,000 people would make. When people were sleeping, time would often pass very quickly. However, it was also nighttime. Lying in the water and lying in the mud, that feeling was completely different. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that a day felt like a year. No matter if they were lying down or lying down, the feeling of being soaked in the rain wouldn't be too good. Not to mention, the light rain didn't seem to have any intention of stopping. Not only that, there was a moderate rain in the middle of the night. That feeling was really uncomfortable. Even so, no one couldn't endure it, because everyone knew that if they dared to stand up at this time, they would definitely become the target of the muskets. The worst thing was that even if they stood up, they didn't know where to run to. Originally, they had retreated by running all the way back. Their bodies were very tired. In addition, they didn't eat much. Under the hunger and sleepiness, their spirits were not good. In such an environment, they could not sleep even if they wanted to. Thus, when the sun began to rise, the morale of the 100,000 Longtime army had already dropped to the lowest point. The summer days were long to begin with, so the sun rose earlier in the morning. The mercenaries who surrounded them only slept for a little more than 2 hours before they had to wake up. Fortunately, they were able to sleep well for the past 2 days. In addition, they were prepared. Every soldier was wearing a raincoat. In terms of mental state, they were much better than the Longtime soldiers. From the moment the sky started to brighten, the mercenaries held their guns tightly in their hands, ready for the Longtime soldiers to counterattack. However, it was obvious that this was unnecessary. Tired, sleepy, and hungry, the soldiers of the Longtime kingdom had long lost the courage to resist. They did not know where to escape to, nor did they know where to go. In such a situation, even though lying on the ground was very uncomfortable, they could only do so. It's about time. Seeing that the expected riot did not happen, 2nd Battalion Commander Chen Bo heaved a sigh of relief. He stood up and his eyes shone. Pass down the order. The cooking squad can start working now. About an hour later, bursts of fragrance began to spread in all directions. When this fragrance entered the noses of the surrounded Longtime soldiers, it caused many of their bodies to move. When a person was very hungry, even the food that they usually disdained to eat would be very delicious. Furthermore, under the orders of Battalion Commander Chen Bo, the cooking squad put a lot of fresh meat in their breakfast. When the smell of the meat soup floated in the air, it only increased their appetite. Under the temptation of the meat soup, many Longtime soldiers forced themselves to look into the distance. What they saw were groups of soldiers in camouflage uniforms and some soldiers in Jiaoji army uniforms queuing up to get food. These soldiers had a big bowl in their left hand and a big bun in their right hand. They were drinking the soup and eating the bun, looking extremely happy. Rumble! At this moment, someone's stomach rumbled. When this rumbling sound rang out, no one laughed at him. On the contrary, when everyone looked into the distance, they could not help but swallow their saliva. It was clear that this scene was not small to them. After another hour, the mercenaries took turns to eat a hot breakfast. To them, in the 3 days that they were hiding here, they had been eating instant noodles, ham sausages, and all kinds of canned food. Although it was not a problem to fill their stomachs, it was not as good as eating hot food. The mercenaries all ate a hot breakfast and were all full. Then, they returned to their respective teams and continued their surveillance work. The only difference was that the pots that were cooking the soup didn't seem to have any intention of stopping. Under the dozens of temporary tents, the soup was still steaming, and the aroma was everywhere. When a new pot of broth had been boiled, and a new pot of steamed buns had been piled up, 2nd Battalion Commander Chen Bo took out a simple loudspeaker and began to broadcast his voice. Soldiers of Longtime Kingdom, I believe that many of you can understand what I am saying. Of course, if you don't understand, it's fine. You can ask the people around you who understand Chinese. Standing on top of a tall post with one hand on his waist and the other holding a megaphone, Chen Bo shouted loudly. Longtime Kingdom was the Lao's protector of the Great Ming Dynasty. Naturally, there was no lack of people who understood Chinese. Because of the influence, there were very few people who did not understand Chinese. Noticing that everyone was looking at him, Chen Bo first laughed and then continued to shout, "Soldiers of Longtime Kingdom, there are only 2 paths in front of you. The first is to stubbornly resist and die. The second is to immediately surrender and live. I won't say anything to those who want to die. You can try to charge out and see if your speed is faster or if our guns are faster. As for the brothers who want to live, you can walk out of the ranks now, lay down your weapons, and surrender. You can drink hot meat soup and eat hot buns. Your lives will be preserved, and the only thing you will lose is your temporary freedom. Otherwise, don't think about playing tricks with us. If anyone wants to fake surrender, I can guarantee that he will suffer a fate worse than death. Alright, whether you live or die is in front of you. Make your own choice." Passing the megaphone in his hand to the signaler, Chen Bo waved his hand and 2,000 Jiaoji mercenaries walked out. Each of them held a long blade in their hands. 200 people in a group stood beside a large pot, ready to accept any surrender at any time. 10,000 people wanting to subdue 100,000 enemy soldiers, it was like a fantasy story. After a night of rain, coupled with the fact that he was tired and hungry, Chen Bo did it just like that. Without any fighting spirit, the 100,000 Longtime soldiers without a leader were like docile little sheep. Seeing a tiger open its bloody mouth, they could only surrender. One by one, the Longtime soldiers climbed up from the ground in a sorry state. Their bodies were covered in mud as they walked over weakly. Of course, even if it was 100,000 broken soldiers, it was still 100,000 lives. If they were not careful, it could lead to irreversible consequences. In order to ensure that these surrendered soldiers were obedient, the surrounding Lung Feng and auxiliary soldiers no longer hid. Instead, they took the initiative to walk out. From time to time, they would even fire a shot into the sky to intimidate the surrendered soldiers who had other ideas. It was clear that Chen Bo was overthinking things. Under the starvation, the Longtime soldiers who had lost their fighting spirit only thought of one thing, and that was to survive. How could they dare to have other thoughts? Furthermore, if they wanted to surrender, they had to throw away the weapons in their hands. If they did not even have weapons to defend themselves, how could they resist? Just like that, the surrender ceremony of less than 100,000 soldiers went unexpectedly smoothly. What made Chen Bo very satisfied was that there was also news from Yinglu City. Su Yunsheng and the Spring Sun Company commander did not disappoint him and successfully took down the city. The surrender ceremony was also going smoothly in the morning. Shiyu City. All kinds of information were gathered in the hands of the sixth young master, Yang Chendong. After knowing that Commander Nietong's plan to lure the enemy was successful and that Lei Xiai's troops had returned to Yinglu City, Yang Chendong knew that the Longtime Kingdom's reinforcements would not be a hindrance to his advance. Even if Chen Bo could not imprison the 100,000 soldiers, he could at least defeat them. Young master, Commander Chen must have made his move last night. Tiger's man analyzed the information and came to the same conclusion. That's right. Yang Chendong agreed. Then he looked in the direction of Shiyu City and said, since Commander Chen has already made his move, then we should also have some progress on our side. Pass down the order, prepare to attack the city. The matter in Jiaoji needs to be resolved as soon as possible. At this point, Yang Chendong could not help but think of the information sent by the Security Bureau 2 days ago. The Southern Ming Imperial bodyguards actually went to Jianing and took away his fourth brother. Although from the information, the other party's attitude was still considered polite when doing this. However, Yang Chendong knew that Zhu Qizhen did not have the courage to lower his face. Therefore, he only took away his fourth brother and did not immediately do anything. To put it bluntly, Zhu Qizhen was targeting him. He wanted to use this as a warning. However, Yang Chendong was not too worried. Although he was a little worried about his fourth brother's safety, he believed that as long as nothing happened to him, Zhu Qizhen would not be so stupid as to go against his fourth brother. After all, killing Yang Chendong would not benefit Yingzong at all. It would only force Yang Chendong to rebel. Chapter 522. Since he could see this, Zhu Qizhen should be able to see it as well. Even fourth brother was taken away, so it could be seen that Zhu Qizhen was afraid of him. In order to suppress his development, Yingzong would definitely think of ways to stop him from expanding. It wouldn't be long before the imperial edict arrived. In other words, he didn't have much time left. Tiger's mane, tell Yang San to think of a way to stop the imperial eunuch. I don't want to see them so soon. Understood. Tiger's mane replied and left. When he gave the order to prepare for the siege, he also called the deputy chief of the Security Bureau, Yang San, over. On the west side of the city, there were many armored soldiers, and the atmosphere was tense. The Longtime Kingdom's 100,000 reinforcements suddenly retreated, which gave King Lili a bad feeling. Even though he had yet to figure out what had happened, he knew that Jiaoji was in grave danger this time. In fact, until now, the Jiaoji Kingdom's communication with the outside world had been cut off. All they could see was what was happening in front of them. Although there was no information from the outside world, as the king of Li, who had once wrestled with the great Ming dynasty, his formidable potential was displayed. He summoned all the civil and military officials and said with certainty, "The mercenaries should be attacking soon. We should also be prepared." There weren't many people who dared to oppose Li Li's words. Crown Prince Li Yuanlong was one of them. Seeing that his father didn't have any information and didn't have any reliable information, he said with a doubtful tone, "Father, why do you say that?" His son was good at everything, but he was a little too confident. With this kind of personality, he wouldn't easily trust others, even if he was his father. In truth, Li Yuanlong still valued his father very much. It was just that he had made some bad decisions in the past, especially when his base of operations in the Nine Truth County had been occupied. This had caused his personality to change a little. He always wanted to prove himself, which led to this problem. If others asked, perhaps Li Li wouldn't give any explanation. After all, he was the king, and he didn't need to consider other people's opinions when making decisions. But the one who asked this question was his son, so everything was a different story. He tried his best to speak in an amiable tone. Father made this decision based on two judgments. First, the Lansong Kingdom's 100,000 reinforcements suddenly retreated. Although we still don't know the reason, their retreat must be caused by the mercenaries. This proves that they are preparing to make a move. 2. Extending the second finger of his right hand, King Li Li continued, "The diplomatic group we sent to contact the southern Ming has already left for a long time. Even the news of the capital being occupied has been sent out for a period of time. Presumably, the current emperor of the southern Ming dynasty should also know about what happened here. Since the mercenaries have such a strong fighting strength, I'm sure that not only us, but also the young emperor of the southern Ming dynasty. Unless there was something wrong with his brain, he would definitely think of a way to stop the mercenaries from growing stronger. If the mercenaries don't make a move now, I'm afraid that they won't have a chance to do anything once the emperor's imperial edict is issued." It had to be said that Li Li's intelligence was indeed very high, and his analysis was also very thorough. This was indeed one of the reasons why Yang Chendong was in a hurry to make a move. Of course, Li Li didn't know that the second reason why Yang Chendong was in a hurry to make a move was because he didn't want to waste too much time on conquering the Jiaoji kingdom. The destruction of a kingdom was a huge matter for the generals and even the monarchs in ancient times. It might even take a long time to prepare for this battle. Even if it took 10, 20, or even longer, it would take several generations of people to work together. However, all of this didn't mean much to Yang Chendong, who had mastered the advanced firearms. Although his strength wasn't too strong right now, it was still possible to win against the great Ming dynasty, but it was impossible to easily conquer the Jiaoji kingdom. After all, the great Ming dynasty's territory was too big, to the point that the people in his hands wouldn't even make a splash. In comparison, Jiaoji was different. It was only a small kingdom, and he was already prepared to conquer it. It must be known that Yang Chendong's ambition was so big that it was impossible for others to understand. Even so, if he had to spend so much time and effort on a small kingdom like Jiaoji, it would be impossible for him to achieve his goal in this lifetime. If he had to spend so much effort on such a small kingdom, what would he do when he faced the big kingdoms? As such, Yang Chendong didn't want to wait any longer. He wanted to make a swift and decisive decision and quickly resolve the matter of Jiaoji. In this way, even if others were dissatisfied with what he had done, what else could they say when he had done all that he had to do? No matter what Yang Chendong was thinking, at least Li Li's analysis was correct. After he explained the two reasons, even Crown Prince Li Yuanlong was convinced. He then said, "Father, since this is the case, should we prepare to fight?" "Of course we should fight, but we also need to make preparations for peace talks." Li Li nodded first, then shook his head and said with a sorrowful tone, "Our Jiaoji is still too weak. We can't continue fighting this war. Otherwise, even if the mercenaries don't destroy us, the others won't let us go." After saying this, Li Li said with a somewhat angry voice, "Send someone to investigate the assassination of the Duchess of Zhongdang. What is going on? That assassin is called Immortal, right? What is his background?" Hearing his father mention this matter, Crown Prince Li Yuanlong immediately reported what he knew. "Father, I have sent someone to investigate Immortal's matter. Although he is from Jiaoji, he is no longer under our control. We have been wrongly accused. Of course this prince knows this, but we still need to give him an explanation. How about this? Let's investigate this matter thoroughly." Li Li said with a dark expression. Immortal tried to assassinate Yang Chendong's wife but was killed before he could succeed. This didn't seem like a big deal. However, it had now become the fuse that ignited the war. If this matter wasn't resolved, the mercenaries wouldn't retreat so easily. Even if it was to give the other party a way out, this matter had to be investigated thoroughly. "Yes, I understand." Li Yuanlong nodded after understanding his father's intentions. "All right, boys, it's time for you to perform. If the mercenaries attack, this king hopes that everyone can give it their all. Only with a perfect performance on the battlefield can the negotiations proceed smoothly. Only then can our Jiaoji kingdom regain its strength and return to its golden age." "Yes." All the civil and military officials lowered their heads in agreement. They knew what would happen to them if they lost the next battle. Becoming a prisoner was probably the best outcome for him. Thinking that they would lose their freedom and all the pleasures of life, it was no wonder that everyone would do their best. Just as the Jiaoji army was preparing, the mercenaries 10 li outside the city started moving forward. 18,000 Jiaoji mercenaries lined up on both sides. The 3 battalions of the Cold Vanguard were at the front as the main force. Beside them were 7 auxiliary battalions and behind them were 7 temporary auxiliary battalions. The army of 25,000 slowly moved forward in an orderly manner. From the original distance of 10 miles to 9 miles, 8 miles, all the way until they were 4 miles away before they finally came to a stop. Facing the mercenaries who were eyeing them covetously, the Jiaoji army in Shiyu City quickly reacted. General Li Shaozhong was the vanguard. He led 30,000 soldiers out of the East City Gate and began to get into formation. If the mercenaries dared to move forward, they would charge forward and fight to the death. Li Shaozhong wasn't a general in the Jiaoji army and wasn't a famous general. However, King Lili still sent him out as the vanguard. It was obvious that he was testing the waters. At the same time, he seemed to be telling Yang Chendong that he didn't intend to fight to the death. If there was anything, they could sit down and discuss it. How could Yang Chendong not see the goodwill shown by the Jiaoji army? Not only did he see it, but the people around him also felt the same way. For example, the commander of the 2nd Battalion, Luope, smiled and said, "6th young master, it seems like they're a bit scared." Ha! Hearing the commander's words, the other officers also laughed loudly. Yang Chendong also had a smile on his face. However, the smile quickly disappeared and was replaced with determination. "Send 2 auxiliary battalions. Let's take care of them first." Fear wasn't the result Yang Chendong wanted. Looking at the history of China, weren't many foreign races like this? When you are weak, they will bully you without any hesitation. When you are strong, they will try to please you with a fearful look. This is the nature of human nature. The difference was that Yang Chendong wasn't as magnanimous. Of course, he wasn't magnanimous. Speaking of which, he was very vengeful. Since they wanted to participate in the Great Ming's internal strife, they had to be prepared to go for wool and come home shorn. There was no such thing as a free lunch in the world. If you wanted to punch someone, you wouldn't let them hit you. Chapter 523. Initially, everyone was worried that the 6th young master would take pity on them for showing weakness. After all, as soldiers, the battlefield was the best place to test themselves. If there were no more battles to fight, their presence would only get weaker and weaker. Now, Yang Chendong did not relent because of their actions. He still decided to fight first. The 7 battalion commanders of the auxiliary battalions were all agitated. However, it was a pity that there were only 2 slots. In an instant, the 7 battalions were fighting over them. Lu Zhuo was also having a headache over the fact that there were clearly not enough slots to go around. Speaking of which, the 7 battalions were not too far apart in terms of fighting strength. It was not easy to choose who to send. After asking for instructions from Yang Chendong, they decided to draw lots to decide who to send. Of course, Lu Zhuo also said that if they were lucky enough to be sent but did not perform well on the battlefield, they would be sent to the sidelines the next time something like this happened. At most, they would be sent to the second echelon. The lucky ones were the 5th and 6th battalions. However, the other battalions were not without hope. As long as they did not perform well, it would be time for them to fight. In order not to give the other battalions a chance, the 5th and 6th battalion commanders gathered their company commanders, platoon commanders, and even squad leaders to hold an emergency meeting. In their words, if anyone messed up in the upcoming battle, they could not blame them for being ruthless and directly expelling them from the military. This was expelling them from the military, not just retirement. The latter would at least not be in the military anymore. They could still do other things. Moreover, with a military background, many units in Xichen City would fight for them. However, if they were really expelled from the military, they would be too ashamed to face anyone. That would be even more painful than death. Yes, the 2 battalions had a total of 800 soldiers. Every one of them was yelling and shouting, looking as though they were going to give it their all. In terms of logistics, the soldiers of the 2 battalions had a decent lunch of 6 meat and 2 vegetables. After resting for 15 minutes, the 800 soldiers leaped over the 3rd Battalion of the Cold Front Battalion and slowly approached the 30,000 Jiaoji soldiers outside the city. No matter where the Cold Front Battalion went, they were the absolute main force. However, they had no intention of fighting the first battle, which made the company commanders below look displeased. 1st Company Commander Tian Su went straight to Battalion Commander Kong Chuanxin to express his dissatisfaction. Battalion Commander, why didn't you let us fight in the first battle? Does the 6th young master have something against us? Bullshit. Kong Chuanxin frowned after hearing this and shouted, bullshit. In comparison, Kong Chuanxin's temper was relatively good among the 3 battalion commanders of Cold Front's 2nd Regiment. Although he didn't have the aura of a scholarly general like that of 2nd Battalion Commander Qinbo, he was at least much better than 1st Battalion Commander Wu Sheng, who was a martial artist. However, at this moment, he couldn't help but curse. He couldn't be blamed for his temper. He was already upset that he hadn't used him in the first battle. He originally thought that the 1st Battalion was still in Langsun, waiting for the Jiaoji army to retreat, while the 2nd Battalion was outside Yinglu City, dealing with the 100,000 Lansong army. Naturally, the heavy responsibility of attacking Nanyu City would fall to him. He had even made preparations to mobilize his troops before the battle. However, who would have thought that the 6th young master wouldn't use them in the first battle and instead sent out 2 auxiliary battalions? This disappointed him and made him angry. Now that the company commanders below were looking for him, it would be strange if he was in a good mood. Although he was angry, Kong Chuanxi knew that he couldn't bring his temper into the army. Therefore, after cursing, he said, "Don't think too much. The 6th young master definitely wants to use the steel on the blade. Don't you know that the enemy's general is just a nobody in the Jiaoji army? Against them, there's no need for a main force like us to fight. Therefore, we should be prepared to fight against their main force. That's what the Cold Front should be doing." Kong Chuanxin's thoughts were exactly what Yang Chendong was thinking. However, they were facing 30,000 Jiaoji soldiers, and they weren't even the strongest. They didn't see any iron shield soldiers or iron chariots. The enemy wasn't even the elephant soldiers or black soldiers. Why would he send out his strongest main force? Sending out 2 auxiliary battalions was already giving them a lot of face. Although it seemed like there was a huge gap between 800 and 20,000, Yang Chendong wasn't worried at all. The mercenaries had the most advanced firearms in the world. As long as they didn't rush over to fight the enemy in close combat, they had a high chance of winning even if they had 800 against 20,000. Just like in the later stages of the Ming Dynasty, the small slave builders only had a few hundred cavalrymen and they were able to kill tens of thousands of Ming Dynasty soldiers. If even they could do it, the mercenaries wouldn't have a problem. Back to the main topic. The 800 soldiers from the 2 auxiliary battalions walked out from the mercenaries and approached the Jiaoji army. Young Master Li was riding on his horse. When he saw that less than 1,000 mercenaries had walked out, he couldn't help but laugh coldly. These mercenaries are too arrogant. Do they really think that they are made of iron and can't be killed? Trying to shake my 30,000-strong army with less than 1,000 men? You are asking for death. I'll grant you your wish. Men, blow the battle horn. Charge and kill them. Although Li Xiaozhong knew that the mercenaries were equipped with advanced firearms, he quickly suppressed his fear when he considered the fact that he had an advantage in numbers. As the order was given, the 30,000 Jiaozhi army advanced step by step under the sharp sound of the battle horn. There were more than 10,000 soldiers, and there was no end to them. Outside the east gate of Shiyu City, when the 30,000 soldiers were spread out, the pressure they exuded was immense. At the very least, these Jiaozhi soldiers were emboldened by this aura. With every step they took, they shouted the word kill. Their voices reverberated between heaven and earth, lingering for a long time without dissipating. On the east gate tower of Shiyu City, King Li and the Crown Prince were watching. When they saw that the mercenaries had sent out less than 1,000 men, they couldn't help but look down on them. Most of them were thinking that even if the mercenaries had advanced weapons, they were still too arrogant to use only 800 to fight 30,000. As long as these people charged in front of them, they would be able to kill the mercenaries with just a spit of saliva. Indeed, many Jiaozhi people had such thoughts. On the other hand, the mercenaries also had the same thought. It was time for the auxiliary soldiers to show off their might. When the 30,000 Jiaozhi soldiers began to move forward, the 800 auxiliary soldiers stopped moving. Then, one by one, the soldiers checked their weapons and ammunition. In just 10 seconds, all the soldiers picked up their guns and looked forward. In fact, they had already checked their weapons countless times before they arrived. Their actions just now were subconscious. 5th Battalion, target 6 to 12 o'clock. Get ready. 6th Battalion, target 12 to 6 o'clock. Get ready. The two auxiliary battalion commanders gave the command to prepare for battle at the same time. 800 soldiers stood in the same line, giving the impression of a long green dragon entrenched on the ground. Open fire. The distance between the two sides was now only 400 meters, completely within the firing range of the muskets. The two battalion commanders immediately gave the order to open fire, and a series of gunshots instantly suppressed the other party's footsteps and sounds. Bullets flew out horizontally. When the Eight-Nation Alliance entered Beijing, there were only 1,000 of them. However, they were able to defeat tens of thousands of Qing soldiers and the Boxer groups. This was the power of firearms. At that time, the Eight-Nation Alliance mostly used rifles, the kind that needed to be reloaded after every shot. Moreover, the effective range of those rifles was only 200 to 300 meters. In comparison, it was much worse than the Type 81 rifles used by the auxiliary soldiers. Even though the Type 81 rifles were made by the Qiqian City Munitions Factory, they were not as good as the Type 81 rifles in Yang Chendong's warehouse. However, there were all kinds of detailed introduction books and the best finished products as templates. The Type 81 rifles produced by the munitions factory were quite good, reaching 70% of the original gun's effect. At the very least, although the Type 81 rifle's effective killing range did not reach the original 800 meters, it could reach the current 500 meters. Currently, at a distance of 400 meters, every bullet could take a person's life. Of course, when facing a black mass of enemies, there was no need to aim. Any bullet that was fired, as long as it did not hit the sky or the ground, could hit someone. Gunshots rang out. When 800 Type 81 rifles were fired at the same time, the scene was very shocking. As their bullets poured out from the barrels of their guns, their enemies, the Jiaozhi soldiers who came from afar, fell to the ground in droves. Previously, they relied on their numbers and were full of morale. Even when they took a step forward and shouted the word, "Kill," it was indeed effective in raising their morale. However, at the end of the day, it was just to encourage themselves. When faced with life and death, no one knew if this courage would be useful. Every time a bullet was fired, a Jiaozhi soldier would fall to the ground. When such things happened one after another without any signs of stopping, even if they still had the courage to shout the word, kill, in reality, they were already afraid. There was no one who was not afraid of death, especially when they knew that they were going to die. They did not even have the mentality to try their luck. One could imagine what kind of blow the morale of the army was taking. Under the shock of the advanced rifles, the morale of the Jiaoji soldiers began to drop. As the figures fell, the Jiaoji soldiers had only advanced 50 meters before they began to stagnate. Some of the more cowardly ones even began to tremble, wondering if they should retreat and run. Chapter 524. Death was scary to some people, but to do it despite knowing that death was inevitable would only make it even scarier. Idiot charge! On top of the city gate tower, Crown Prince Li Yuanlong watched his soldiers die one by one under the mercenaries' guns. In fact, there were hundreds of people paying the price with their lives every breath. It would be a lie to say that he did not feel heartache. However, since they had already charged, there was no turning back. Since that was the case, they should be thinking about how to achieve victory. Without a doubt, how were they going to charge past the hundreds of enemies? The most important thing was to engage in close combat and reduce the effectiveness of the enemy's firearms. Perhaps to prove the Crown Prince's words, the commanding general below the city wall, Li Shaozhong, happened to give the order for the entire army to charge. He continued to shout the battle cry, and at the same time he shouted to the people around him in a bewitching manner, "They only have 800 people. As long as we can rush to their side, victory will belong to us. Charge! Whoever kills one enemy will be promoted by 3 ranks, and will be rewarded with 100 taels of silver." With such a great reward, brave men were bound to come forward. Especially when Li Shaozhong killed a few soldiers who wanted to retreat, the other Jiaoji soldiers gritted their teeth and charged forward. That's right, once they charged forward, the firearms in the hands of the mercenaries would not be as effective. That would be the time for them to kill the enemy. Retreat! Seeing that the enemy had finally come to their senses and knew how to charge, the 2 commanding generals of the Jiaoji battalion immediately ordered. At the same time, the soldiers of the 5th and 6th battalions gave the order to retreat. At the same time, the guns in their hands continued to spit out flames and bullets. Jiaoji soldiers kept falling in the path of the charge. However, because one side was charging with full force while the other side was retreating, the distance between the 2 sides was slowly closing as more and more people died. First platoon, activate continuous fire mode. Fire all your bullets quickly. Second platoon, third platoon, prepare to fire. Seeing that the distance between the 2 sides had been reduced from 400 meters to less than 100 meters, and soon it was only 60 to 70 meters, and the distance was still rapidly shrinking, the 5th and 6th battalion commanders issued a new order. It would be a lie to say that they were not afraid when facing the charge of tens of thousands of people with only 800 people. After all, the momentum of so many people rushing over was very frightening. Fortunately, their usual training was effective. Yang Chendong had long anticipated that they would often be outnumbered, so when he trained them, he placed special emphasis on courage. The lone hero had become the role model and goal in the hearts of all the warriors. In addition, the 2 battalion commanders had already said that if anyone dropped the ball, they would face the consequences of being expelled from the army. After all, the 6th young master was watching from behind. As a member of the auxiliary troops, it was rare for him to be in the limelight like this. If he retreated out of fear, or even ran away, he would lose all his face. It was under such encouragement that none of the soldiers retreated even though they were still a little afraid. Instead, they listened to the orders of the 2 battalion commanders. They opened fire and dropped bombs. Everything seemed to be in order. Seeing that the mercenaries were getting closer and closer, the eyes of the Jiaoji soldiers at the front glowed with excitement. In their eyes, victory was right in front of them. As long as they advanced a few dozen meters, as long as they could get close to the mercenaries, the effects of their firearms would be limited. That would be the time for them to show off their might. Dreams were beautiful, but reality was cruel. Just as these Jiaoji soldiers were trying their best to run forward and seemed to have seen the light at the end of the tunnel, hundreds of objects suddenly flew over their heads. Those objects seemed to have grown eyes as they landed in the midst of the charging Jiaoji soldiers. In the next moment, a series of deafening explosions were heard. Correspondingly, Jiaoji soldiers were blown away by the explosions. Grenades could be considered as small cannons for close combat. Once they landed in a crowd, the impact was so great that everything within a 3-meter radius would be flattened. The pitiful Jiaoji soldiers at the front were instantly devoured by the power of the gunpowder. Tot-tot. The Type 81 rifles of the 2 auxiliary platoons were in continuous firing mode. In that instant, bullets rained down on the Jiaoji soldiers. Some of the Jiaoji soldiers who were lucky enough not to be hit by the grenades became live targets. One by one, they were hit by the bullets and fell to the ground. Grenades, throw them! With each squad as a unit, the sounds of explosions were incessant. While corpses were sent flying, deep craters of varying sizes were blasted into the ground. No one knew which Jiaoji soldier was the first to shout, but the Jiaoji army that was charging forward with an aggressive momentum finally began to retreat. Especially when some of the soldiers realized that the explosive objects that were thrown on the ground had a limited range, they began to run even faster. The initial wave of ferocious attacks was thus suppressed. Chase and fire at the same time. Seeing an opportunity, the 5th and 6th Battalion commanders put away their grenades and raised their guns to give chase. The Jiaoji soldiers behind them who were too slow to escape fell to the ground one by one. In the middle of the mercenary army, Yang Chundong observed all of this with his binoculars. A look of relief appeared on his face. Just a moment ago, he had already planned to send the other auxiliary battalions and even the main battalion of the Cold Front. After all, if the Jiaoji soldiers had really reached them, the consequences would have been unimaginable. Such a loss was not something he wanted to see. Fortunately, the 2 auxiliary battalions did not disappoint him. They withstood the initial pressure and won the final victory. Of course, facing such an attack, Yang Chundong actually had a better idea. For example, he could casually take out a few powerful cannons from the warehouse. When the cannons were fired, the enemy's attack would be instantly neutralized. However, he did not do so in the end. He was not worried about how to explain the sudden appearance of the cannons. After all, the Cold Front soldiers had already treated him as a god. He did not need to explain anything to anyone. What he was worried about was that if he used the cannons this time, what about the next time? When he was not on the battlefield, what would happen if the mercenaries wanted to attack the city or even destroy the country? It was impossible to have the help of the cannons every time. Without chariots, not to mention the difficulty of transporting such a thing, if such a treasure fell into the hands of the enemy, the consequences would be fatal. Of course, it was necessary to use the cannons appropriately. After all, the Cold Front would need to be equipped with a certain number of cannons in the future. However, even if they were to be used, they would have to be used on the blade. On the battlefield, as the mercenaries retreated, the 2 auxiliary battalions began to counterattack. Although their footsteps were not very fast, because the enemy was still within shooting range of the 81 caliber guns, every time they fired, there would still be enemies who would fall to the ground. Open the city gates and let them in. On the tower of Xiu City, seeing the defeated Jiaoji soldiers being slaughtered right under his nose, the king of Lily's face was already pale. He suddenly realized that he seemed to be really old. He actually began to feel fear from the bottom of his heart. This was something that had never happened to him when he was young. Even when he was facing the powerful Ming dynasty, he still dared to make his own voice and arm wrestle. But now, in the face of the seemingly invincible mercenaries who were able to repel his 30,000-strong army with less than 1,000 people, he really didn't know what to do or what to do at this moment. On the tower, the Jiaoji archers began to continuously fire arrows. Although they were far from being able to hit the mercenaries who were still 400 meters away, they at least had to show that they had the ability to counterattack. The East City Gate was already wide open, allowing General Li Shaozhong and his defeated soldiers to successfully enter the city. Although they were defeated, they were still Jiaoji soldiers after all. Needless to say, who would not be defeated when facing such an opponent? After the soldiers surged into the city gate, they did not even have time to care about the wounded soldier who was shot but did not die. The city gate was quickly closed. They were afraid that the mercenaries would take the opportunity to directly attack the city. However, in reality, the two auxiliary battalions had already retreated. In this battle, they had killed at least a few thousand people and successfully completed their mission. When the 5th and 6th Battalion commanders returned to the barracks, they were naturally praised by Yang Chendong. He also announced that their contributions would be recorded and would be rewarded when the time was right. The two battalion commanders immediately received countless envious gazes. Although the other battalion commanders were also jealous, they knew that these two battalion commanders had some ability after witnessing everything. Just the fact that they were able to remain unmoved in the face of 10 times the enemy's pressure was already admirable. As for contributions, with so many enemies, was there a need to be afraid that there would not be any more battles to fight in the future? As long as one was strong enough, gold would always shine. After the battle, it was almost night time. Yang Chendong had no intention of launching a night attack. It was not that he did not have the ability to do so, but the current Jiaoji was not worth it for him to do so. Therefore, other than the soldiers who were left behind to carry out the necessary patrols, the rest of the soldiers went to bed early after dinner. Others could rest, but Yang Chendong could not. He still had too many things to do. For example, the 2nd Battalion commander, Qin Bo, had sent news that they had successfully completed their mission. They had killed General Ati of the Lansong Kingdom's reinforcements and more than 5,000 soldiers. The remaining 95,000 Lansong soldiers and 1,000 Jiaoji soldiers in Yinglu City had all become captives. After the first step was completed, Chen Bo asked for instructions on what to do next. In response, Yang Chendong gave the orders while Tiger's Mane recorded them down. Inform Hanoi City to send out 20,000 educated youths from Chichen City. Leave 2,000 of them in Yinglu City to carry out preaching activities. The rest will help Battalion Commander Chen to take the captives back. Inform the Navy to be prepared to send the captives to Chichen City. Chapter 525. After dealing with the matter of Yinglu City in a decisive manner, he picked up another piece of information to read. When he saw the information, Yang Chendong couldn't help but laugh coldly. The information came from the Southern Ming Empire's imperial palace. The person who sent the information was one of the chief eunuchs, Mao Mu. As the most important spy by Ying Zong's side, unless it was a major event, he wouldn't send out any information. Since the information came from him, it must be very important. Just like what was recorded in the information, Ying Zong actually listened to the opinions of his ministers and wanted to borrow money from Yang Chendong. The emperor of a country actually wanted to borrow money from his ministers. Wasn't this a very comical matter? However, it happened now, and Yang Chendong became the main character of this matter. Obviously, one of the ministers didn't like him and wanted to smear some medicine on him. In addition, the Southern Ming Empire had just separated and their foundation wasn't very solid. Then there was civil strife in the south. When they quelled the rebellion, they spent a lot of money. Now that they didn't have to pay taxes from Guangdong, Guangxi, and Yunnan, their lives were even more difficult. At this time, they had to recruit 1 million more soldiers. The amount of money they needed to spend was uncountable. The treasury was running out of money. Someone suggested that they could borrow money from Yang Chendong. After all, this person had set up a bank in Baiming. It was said that his savings had reached more than 40 million taels. It shouldn't be a problem to borrow 20 to 30 million taels. Zhu Qizhen, who was lacking money, felt that this seemed to be a feasible path after hearing the suggestions of his ministers. He decided to let the eunuch in charge of announcing the edict tell Yang Chendong to stop sending troops to Jiaoji. Then, he would ask him to lend money to the Southern Ming Empire to tide over the current crisis. Mao Mu said this in the information. After being sent by the Security Bureau, the information was first placed in front of Yang Chendong. Seeing that this was simply wishful thinking, Hu Mang wanted to throw the report away the moment he saw it. However, considering that this matter was not known to the young master, once the imperial eunuch from the southern Ming Empire arrived, wouldn't he be unprepared? Thus, in the end, this piece of information still appeared in front of Yang Chendong. Now that he saw Yang Chendong laughing while holding the information, Tiger's Mane suggested, "Young master, I think Zhu Qizhen's head must have been kicked by a donkey. This is just wishful thinking. We don't have to pay attention to it." Yang Chendong also said that his head had been kicked by a donkey. He used it to describe those ignorant people who made ignorant decisions. When the mercenary officers heard it, they felt that the description was very appropriate, so they often used it. Hearing Tiger's Mane's suggestion, Yang Chendong tilted his head and looked at him. "Do you also think that Zhu Qizhen's head is rusty?" Seeing that Yang Chendong didn't seem to think so, Tiger's Mane said with a puzzled expression, "Young master, isn't that the case? Even an idiot can see that he wants to strengthen the southern Ming Empire. With our development, it is only a matter of time before we become enemies. If we help them now, isn't it the same as creating a powerful enemy for ourselves?" It was no wonder that Tiger's Mane said this. Originally, when Yang Chendong was building an army in Qiqian City, they didn't understand the young master's intentions. After all, the great Ming Empire was too powerful in their eyes. They were so powerful that they couldn't be shaken. They didn't even dare to think about it. However, after wiping out the Huang bandit army and conquering several cities in Jiaoxi, they changed their minds. With such a powerful army and heaven-defying firearms, why couldn't they set their sights on something bigger? Didn't the ancients say that it was better to be a king than a general? Since that was the case, why couldn't they dream about becoming an emperor? Moreover, the great Ming dynasty was originally snatched from the Yuan dynasty, so it seemed reasonable for someone else to snatch it away from them. It had to be said that Tiger's Mane wasn't the only one who had such thoughts. Many of the high-ranking officers in the mercenary army also had such thoughts. It could be said that this had already formed a certain scale. This way, if Yang Chendong wanted to attack the great Ming Empire one day, there wouldn't be any resistance. However, in Yang Chendong's eyes, this wasn't the case. At the very least, he knew that the so-called one day was still far away from him. As for the reason, of course, it was because of the population. Before solving this problem, Yang Chendong really didn't want to fall out with the great Ming Empire. Otherwise, who knew how much effort and time it would take to solve these problems? Towards the great Ming Empire, Yang Chendong naturally couldn't be like how he was towards Jiaoxi, where he could destroy a country and kill people at will. If he didn't use such extreme methods, it would take too much effort and time to solve the great Ming Empire's problem. With the idea of easy first and difficult later, Yang Chendong decided to put the great Ming Empire's problem aside for now. As long as he was strong enough, he believed that one day he would be able to subdue the enemy without fighting. Since that was the case, he couldn't fall out with them. In other words, he really had to borrow money. Of course, lending money to the great Ming Empire wasn't all bad. For example, he could use this opportunity to raise some conditions. What did the great Ming Empire have the most? Naturally, it was the Han population. If he could use this to make a deal, Zhu Qizhen would definitely agree. If a large number of people could be used in an open and above-board manner, it would play a very positive role in accelerating the development of Crimson Castle, the entire Ryukyu Island, and even the entire Yang family's development. That was not something that could be achieved with just a few silver taels. In other words, the thing that Yang Chendong didn't lack the most right now was money. Putting aside the fact that the goods in the Outer Heavens Trading Company had always been in short supply, especially after the cooperation with the Walla, many things had begun to be exported to Europe and had become items that the rich people there fought to buy. Just based on this, silver was continuously sent to the Yang clan. Moreover, as the Yang clan's navy continued to grow stronger, the amount of transactions at sea was also increasing. In the warehouse in Crimson City, silver had long been piled up like a mountain. There was so much that he didn't even know how to spend it. If there was a chance in the future, Yang Chendong would consider using his own banknotes. After all, using silver as currency was somewhat wasteful. Just the silver itself would be consumed. Even with the assistance of the Yang clan's bank, the Yang clan's bank didn't exist everywhere. Banknotes weren't good for real circulation, but it would be much better if he could use banknotes instead. Of course, this was just an idea. There was still a lot of preparation work to be done. If it was done, the silver would be so much that he wouldn't be able to spend it all. He could lend it to the great Ming Empire in exchange for a sufficient number of people. No matter how he looked at it, it was worth it. After having a rough idea in his mind, Yang Chendong put this matter aside. Since the person who was talking about this matter was the eunuch who came to announce the edict, it would take a long time for them to reach him. For now, it was more important to solve the problem of Jiaoji. Speaking of the problem of Jiaoji, Beta Persei, who was guarding outside the door, strode into the tent. When he saw Yang Chendong, he cupped his fists and said, "Young master, someone from Jiaoji is here. He says that he must see you." "Let him in." Yang Chendong's face was calm. This was within his expectations. After all, it was reasonable for them to send someone to negotiate when the enemy was about to arrive at the city gates. However, he didn't know what the other party would say. Beta Persei left and quickly returned to the tent, bringing in a man in his 30s. When the man entered the tent, he first sized up Yang Chendong. A look of surprise flashed across his eyes. Then he imitated the Han people and cupped his fists and said, "The Crown Prince of Jiaoji, Li Yuanlong, greets the great Ming Empire's Duke of Loyalty." "You're the Crown Prince of Jiaoji." When Tiger's Mane heard his name, he was shocked. Even Yang Chendong's eyes darkened. However, they quickly returned to normal. He didn't know how many enemies and countries he would have to face in the future. It was just a small Crown Prince of Jiaoji. He was very satisfied with Tiger's Mane's performance. Li Yuanlong nodded and said confidently, "That's right, I'm the Crown Prince of Jiaoji." The battle during the day had already proven the strength of the mercenaries. Everyone knew that if this battle were to continue, it was very likely that the Jiaoji army would be the one to lose. Imagine, how could you hurt your opponent when you couldn't even touch their body? If you lost on the battlefield, you had no choice but to negotiate. Although you might have to pay a high price, it was still better than being defeated or even killed. However, who would be sent to negotiate with Yang Chendong became a headache for King Li. Instead of calling it a negotiation, it would be more accurate to call it a truce. Naturally, the ministers were unwilling to do such a task. On the other hand, some courageous young ministers wanted to seize the opportunity. However, their status was too low. Not only would they be looked down upon during the negotiation, they wouldn't be able to make the decision on many matters. In the end, after much consideration, King Li's gaze fell on his son. Whether it was in terms of status or charisma, this son of the crown prince was the best choice. In fact, Li Yuanlong didn't disappoint his father. When he saw his father looking at him, he took the initiative to stand up and take on the responsibility. That was why he appeared in the mercenaries' tent. "You're quite brave." Tiger's Mane was still in shock. Of course, this was said by Yang Chendong. This couldn't be blamed on Tiger's Mane. In the past, he was just a study companion of the 6th young master. To put it bluntly, he was just a servant of the Yang family. With such a status, it was inevitable that he would feel uneasy when meeting the crown prince of a country. On the other hand, Yang Chendong had interacted with the northern and southern emperors of the great Ming dynasty. Naturally, his horizons were broader. Although he was a little flustered by Tiger's Mane's appearance, he quickly calmed down. Chapter 526. That was because Yang Chendong knew that with his current status and advantage, the crown prince of Jiaoji was nothing to him. When Li Yuanlong saw how quickly Yang Chendong regained his composure, he sighed inwardly. Yang Chendong was both young and extraordinary. He put aside his shock at Yang Chendong's youth and said with a smile, "As the ancients say, when two armies fight, they don't kill the envoys. Besides, I have no grievances with the Duke of Loyalty and Courage. What use is there for you to take this crown prince's head? Why bother being an evil person, right?" On the surface, he pretended to be indifferent, but the words that came out of his mouth betrayed him. He was afraid that Yang Chendong would really do something to him, so he first explained some principles, saying that if Yang Chendong targeted him, the consequences would be more harmful than beneficial. Naturally, Yang Chendong understood the meaning behind Li Yuanlong's words and couldn't help but smile. Indeed, he didn't have any thoughts about the crown prince's life, so he wouldn't kill him. However, since Li Yuanlong had appeared in front of him so openly, it wouldn't be in line with Yang Chendong's character if he were to let him be too complacent. Therefore, Li Yuanlong smiled and said with a stern expression, "You don't deserve to address yourself as the crown prince in front of me. If there is a next time, you will be severely punished." When Li Yuanlong saw the smile on Yang Chendong's face, he thought that his words had struck a chord with Yang Chendong. Who would have thought that Li Yuanlong would suddenly fall out with him? Li Yuanlong then realized that he was indeed a little too comfortable just now. He immediately cupped his fists and said, "Yes, I am too used to addressing myself as the crown prince. It is my fault." With one sentence, Li Yuanlong, who had lowered his head, had already expressed his attitude and position, that was, he was really afraid of death and Yang Chendong's anger. Li Yuanlong was so cooperative and put his identity so low, which made Yang Chendong have a new level of respect for him. If this person was incomparably arrogant, even if he didn't kill him, he would humiliate him properly, or even scare him a little to make him lose face. But since the other party was so low-key, he couldn't be too forceful. Bullying a person who didn't dare to fight back was really not fun. "Alright, since you're here, take a seat. Tiger's Mane, go out and keep an eye on them. No one is to disturb them without orders." Yang Chendong said casually to Tiger's Mane. He wanted to see how sincere the crown prince of Jiaoji was. Tiger's Mane originally wanted to stay and protect the young master. However, when he thought of the young master's true strength, he knew that he was unnecessary. He immediately nodded and left. Perhaps it was because of his rebirth, but Yang Chendong had become familiar with his body. His body's potential began to explode. His strength, speed, spear skills, and perception were stronger than when he was at his peak in his previous life. Just a few days ago, when he was bored in Hanoi City, he called the 20 people from the second guard team and asked them to attack him together. To everyone's surprise, the final winner turned out to be Yang Chendong himself. Although he had taken a lot of punches and kicks because of this, he was the one standing in the end. Even the punches and kicks that he took quickly returned to normal as he continued to breathe in and out. This was all because of the qi that suddenly appeared in his body. Yang Chendong didn't have any impression of how this qi was formed and when it appeared. Anyway, he knew that with this qi in his body, his strength had more than doubled. And this strength was still increasing. This time, he challenged the second guard team. Next time, he would challenge the first guard team. He wanted to see where his limit was. Tiger's Mane, who had been by Yang Chendong's side for a long time, was very clear about these things. The young master was so strong that he was even a little abnormal. What was so scary about leaving him and the crown prince of Jiaoji alone in the tent? It would be best if this person didn't have any bad intentions. Otherwise, he would really be in trouble. Tiger's Mane left without any hesitation. When only the two of them were left in the tent, Li Yuanlong stood up and bowed to Yang Chendong. He said, "Yuanlong thanks the Duke of Loyalty." This gratitude was naturally to thank Yang Chendong for saving his face. Otherwise, if there were outsiders present, it would be hard for him, the crown prince, to lower his head. "That's enough. There are no outsiders here. Why don't you tell me what you want?" Yang Chendong had no intention of building a relationship with Li Yuanlong. Although he was the crown prince of a country, in Yang Chendong's eyes, he was just a defeated general. Since he was a defeated general, his status naturally didn't matter. Phew! Li Yuanlong heaved a sigh of relief and sat back down on his chair. His mind quickly went through the main points of the negotiation. When he raised his head again, he opened his mouth and said, "Duke of Loyalty and Courage, the strength of the mercenary army is something that my father and I, as well as all of the Jiaoji officials, have witnessed clearly. We admit that if we were to fight, we would be no match for you. That's why I only have one goal in mind, and that is to ask the Duke of Loyalty to withdraw your troops. As for the price, please state it clearly. As long as it is within our means, we will do our best to satisfy you. How about it?" It's not that you would be no match for us in a fight, it's that you wouldn't even be a match for us. Yang Chendong corrected Li Yuanlong's words. Then he ignored Li Yuanlong's ugly expression and continued, "It's impossible for me to withdraw my troops. Either we fight until Jiaoji is destroyed, or you surrender voluntarily and admit that Jiaoji is a province of the mercenary army. This way, you and your father will not have to worry about food and clothing for the rest of your lives." As for the consequences of not surrendering voluntarily, Yang Chendong didn't state it clearly. However, he believed that Li Yuanlong should be able to imagine it. As expected, after hearing Yang Chendong's words, Li Yuanlong was stunned. Then, as if he heard wrongly, he said, "Duke of Loyalty? What did you say?" "I didn't hear wrongly, did I? You want Jiaoji to become a province of the mercenary army and not a province of the great Ming dynasty?" Indeed, this was what shocked Li Yuanlong. If it was the former, he would be shocked as well, but it wouldn't be as intense as it was now. What is this Duke of Loyalty trying to do? Does he want to betray the great Ming dynasty? As soon as this thought appeared in his mind, it was immediately confirmed. Yes, this Duke of Loyalty must be thinking this way. He has already proven his strength with his actions. It seems that even my father has underestimated this person. Li Yuanlong's expression kept changing. Yang Chendong didn't say anything. He had already made his intentions clear. Even though it wasn't appropriate for him to reveal his thoughts so early, especially in front of the enemy, if he didn't even have this much courage, how could he conquer the world? As for whether Li Yuanlong would inform the great Ming dynasty of his thoughts if he didn't agree, he didn't care. At most, he would just deny it. Without any evidence, who could say anything? Furthermore, whether it was the southern Ming dynasty or Bai Ming, they probably didn't want to fall out with him. Otherwise, everyone knew what kind of price they would have to pay. Li Yuanlong was truly shocked. He knew that Yang Chendong was a powerful person. Furthermore, he was so young, so it was inevitable that he would be hot-blooded and radical in his actions. However, he didn't expect his goal to be so big. He actually wanted to take over the entire Jiaoji. Wasn't he afraid of indigestion? There were too many questions in his mind, but Li Yuanlong didn't voice them out. This was because he couldn't possibly agree to the other party's request. He was here to negotiate, not to surrender on behalf of the entire Jiaoji. If Yang Chendong was willing to retreat, even if the request was a little too much, he would find a way to satisfy it. However, he couldn't make the decision to surrender without fighting. His status didn't allow him to make such a decision. Li Yuanlong was silent for a long time. When the shock in his heart subsided, he looked at Yang Chendong with a hint of expectation in his eyes and asked, "Duke of Loyalty? Was there really no other way? As long as you retreat, no matter what request you have, we will do our best to satisfy it. What do you think? You can either surrender, and you and your father can still live a good life. Of course, you won't have any power. Or you can choose another path. Tomorrow morning, my mercenary army will attack the city. When that time comes, all of you will die without a burial place." Yang Chendong stared into Li Yuanlong's eyes and said seriously. At this moment, he definitely wouldn't give Li Yuanlong any hope or expectation. This was something that couldn't be changed from the first sentence he said. Seeing Yang Chendong's seriousness, Li Yuanlong knew that there was no way out. However, he could never agree to such a condition. He even wanted to stand up and yell at Yang Chendong at the moment. It was simply impossible. However, such a thought only flashed through his mind for a moment. He couldn't take his life as a joke. Although he was indeed happy to roar like that, once he angered Yang Chendong, he was afraid that his little life would be left here. This was not what he wanted to see at all. Alright, this is a serious matter. I want to go back and discuss it with my father. Li Yuanlong took a step back and said. He didn't want to negotiate anymore. He just wanted to return to Shiyu City first. Sure. Yang Chendong nodded. This answer surprised Li Yuanlong. I can even give you a warning. If you don't give me an accurate answer by noon tomorrow, I will attack the city. When that time comes, you won't have a choice. Chapter 527. He originally thought that Yang Chendong would not let him go so easily. Who would have thought that he would allow him to leave just like that? Was this confidence? Or arrogance? But no matter what, it was best to escape from this place. Li Yuanlong immediately stood up and nodded. Rest assured, Duke of Loyalty, I know what to do. Li Yuanlong finally left. Until he left, Yang Chendong did not even stand up from his chair once. He only called for Tiger's Mane outside the tent and asked him to send the Crown Prince of Jiaoji away. If he did not do so, Li Yuanlong would not be able to safely return to the city. Tiger's Mane quickly returned. Young master, I have sent him away. Returning to report was not the main reason. His main purpose was to ask about the negotiations and what the mercenaries were going to do next. Yang Chendong, who was very clear about Tiger's Mane's thoughts, nodded lightly and then ordered, inform all the officers to attack the city at noon tomorrow. Yang Chendong was very clear that Li Yuanlong and his father, Li, would definitely not agree to his conditions. Surrendering without even putting up a fight. Even an incapable ruler would find it difficult to make such a decision, let alone the Li father and son who boasted of their abilities. But he still let Li Yuanlong leave. Perhaps only he himself knew the reason behind this. Yang Chendong did this intentionally. He wanted to set an example for others. He could give anyone a chance, but there was only one chance. If you did not grasp it, the consequences would be unimaginable. In this way, when other small countries used the same method on them, they would seriously consider it. As long as one small country surrendered without a fight, tonight's matter would not have been in vain. This was Yang Chendong's intention. He cared about the future and the situation in the future. However, Li Yuanlong, who couldn't see this, arrived at the foot of the city wall in a panic. He sat on the hanging basket and returned to the city tower. Soon, he appeared in front of his father, Li. The crown prince returned. In the temporary palace, Li wasn't the only one who didn't rest. None of the civil and military officials were resting. They were waiting for the crown prince to return. They wanted to see what kind of demands he had made, how they would respond, and what concessions they would make. As soon as he entered the temporary hall, Li Yuanlong could feel hundreds of eyes looking at him. If it was in the past, he would be secretly happy to be the center of attention, but at this moment he was a little annoyed by the way people were staring at him. Dragoni, how is it? This time, before anyone else could ask, King Lily spoke first. Just from this point alone, it was clear that he had lost his usual composure. This was not Li's fault, and it had nothing to do with his age. All of this was because after Crown Prince Li Yuanlong had left the city and discussed with the generals, he had been shocked to discover that they had no way to deal with the mercenaries, nor did they see any hope of victory. This was what caused Lily to be shocked. Could it be that other than negotiation and compromise, there was no other way? It was because of this that he placed all his hopes on his son, hoping that Li Yuanlong could bring him a good result. Even though he knew that the mercenaries would definitely demand an exorbitant price, he still hoped that they would be more polite. After all, weren't the Han people used to learning from Confucianism, talking about moderation, talking about the demeanor of a great country, and forgiving people when possible? As long as you expressed your acceptance, you would usually receive their forgiveness. Perhaps it was because of this that when the Han people were weak, so many people would stand up to bully them. Repaying evil with good, this was what the Han people were most willing to do. Often, doing this would bring them a good reputation. But did they not think about how to repay kindness? Of course, this was a bit off topic. When Li Yuanlong heard his father personally ask, he didn't know how to answer. He stood there for a long time without making a sound. Li Yuanlong's silence made King Lily very anxious. Dragoni, what is the situation? Did you not see the Ming dynasty's Duke of Loyalty and Courage? Shaking his head, Li Yuanlong said, I saw him. You saw him? Then what did he say? Lily let out a sigh of relief, but seeing that Li Yuanlong didn't say anything for a long time, he couldn't help but say anxiously, did he put forward some harsh conditions? What is going on? Say something. Not only was the king anxious, but the other officials were also anxious, waiting for Li Yuanlong's answer. First, he took a deep breath. Perhaps he also knew that some things were unavoidable. Rather than not saying anything and letting everyone guess, he might as well say it openly. Perhaps before there was no way out, everyone could still unleash their potential and defeat the mercenaries. This prince saw him, and he only made one request. In the following time, Li Yuanlong described the process of his meeting with Yang Chendong in detail. His memory was quite good, and he didn't miss anything. But because of this, these words had a great impact on everyone. Perhaps no one would have thought that the other party's appetite was so big. At some point, King Lily had returned to his large chair, and his expression was terrifyingly ugly. The other officials weren't any better. Apart from a few low-ranking officials who were still whispering and expressing their opinions, some of the more shrewd and capable officials were silent, standing there with gloomy expressions. To them, negotiation was their only hope. As long as the other party could retreat, Jiaoji would have a chance to start over. As for what they would have to pay for this, there was nothing they could do about it. Who asked their enemies to be mercenaries? Who asked them to send troops to Nanming first? And who asked the assassin called Mo Tuo to be a Jiaoji citizen? Based on this, it was only right for them to pay a price, or rather, there was nothing they could do. But now, Yang Chendong wanted the entire Jiaoji, and this was something they didn't want to see. Killing people was nothing more than a nod of the head, not to mention the fact that they were the ones being killed. Now, they didn't even have a way out for themselves. How could they, who already felt wronged, accept such conditions? No, we can't admit defeat like this. Our military strength is more than 10 times that of theirs, and we can still fight. Chen Heijin, the famous general of the Jiaoji army, was the first to voice his opinion. Yes, we can't admit defeat. Even if we die in battle, we can't be scared to death. Another famous general of Jiaoji, Fan Yuhai, also expressed his opinion, and his opinion was the same as Chen Heijin's. With these two taking the lead, the military's opinion was very clear, and this brought hope to King Lily. How confident are you that you can defeat the mercenaries? Facing the king's question, the two generals looked at each other, then shook their heads in unison. After witnessing the might of the mercenaries' firearms, how could they still have the confidence to defeat their opponents? Then, how confident are you that you can defend the city? Although Lily was a little disappointed, he knew that this wasn't the fault of the two generals. The mercenaries were just too strong, completely beyond the strength of this era. It was like when the Qing dynasty fought against the Eight-Nation Alliance. No matter how many soldiers you had, when cold weapons faced hot weapons, you had no chance of winning. I don't know, but we have to defend it. If we really can't, we can use people to fill in the gaps. If the Southern Ming Emperor's decree arrives earlier, perhaps things will turn for the better. Fan Yuhai shook his head, then he gave everyone hope. That was, they still had outside help. Speaking of which, it was a little funny. This outside help was actually the Southern Ming regime that they had always regarded as their enemy, and they had taken advantage of them. This was something that couldn't be helped. If they didn't rely on the Southern Ming, Jiaoji wouldn't exist anymore. One had to know that this was different from when they submitted to the Great Ming. At that time, they only submitted on the surface, and at most, the Great Ming would send a few officials to hold down the fort. They still had full autonomy. If the time was right, it would be easy for them to revolt. However, if they surrendered to the mercenaries, their future would be uncertain. Perhaps Jiaoji would never have the chance to rise again. Fan Yuhai placed his hopes on the Southern Ming, and King Lili also had some hope. However, after thinking about it, it seemed that this was the only way. He could only helplessly say, "All right, since that's the case, then prepare for war. Prepare the trebuchets in the city. Even if we can't hit them, we can at least use them as a deterrent. Also, when we fight, we must set up a powerful supervision team. Today's scene of the defeated army retreating must not happen again." Before the Crown Prince came back, when everyone talked about today's battle, they more or less felt that it was a pity. In their opinion, if the soldiers didn't fear death and continued to charge forward, they might be able to reach the mercenaries. If that was the case, they might be able to see the hope of victory. The king had made a decision, and that was to fight. Then, they would stall for time until the Southern Ming Emperor stopped the mercenaries. In order to achieve this goal, Lili first took out his own 30,000 King's Guards. Then, The crown prince also took out his 20,000 elite crown soldiers. Then, there were Chen Heijin's 25,000 black soldiers and Fan Yuhai's 20,000 elephant soldiers. Together, there were 100,000 elite soldiers. In addition, there were 100,000 regular soldiers. If they had to stall, they should be able to resist for a while. Chapter 528. The meeting lasted until late at night. Only then did the officials leave the temporary palace and head back to their temporary residences. It could be seen that every official who walked out of the palace had a dignified expression, but at the same time, there were some whose eyes flickered as if they were thinking about something. Among them, there was one whose face was gloomy all the way home. It wasn't until the door of the residence closed from the inside that he relaxed and sat down on the wooden chair in the study room with a plop. Then he slowly exhaled a long breath of air. He sat on the chair as if his body had fallen apart. Even the kerosene lamp in the study was slightly lit. This was a habit of his. He liked to think in the dark. But this time, a ghost-like voice appeared beside his ear. "Lord Qin, are you feeling very vexed?" "Who is it?" Lord Qin stood up as if there was a spring installed under his butt. His face was filled with panic. Then cold sweat dripped down his cheeks. It was no wonder he was so frightened. This was his residence, his study. It was the safest and most hidden place in his life. He was different from the other officials of Jiaoji. Most of them were outsiders. However, he was not. Chen Di was the imperial advisor of Jiaoji and also the magistrate of Shiyu City. After all, Shiyu City was his home ground. However, a stranger actually came in and out of this place that he thought was safe. His eyes were already used to the darkness. He saw a black shadow appear in front of him. There was no candlelight. This made the black shadow look even more sinister and mysterious. It was this feeling that made Lord Qin have goosebumps all over his body. It wasn't hard for him to imagine that if that person didn't want to talk to him, but wanted to make things difficult for him, or even kill him, then wouldn't he have already become a corpse that was gradually turning cold? Qin Di was so nervous. He looked like a hedgehog with spikes all over his body. It seemed like he would explode at any moment. The black shadow saw all of this. He chuckled, "Lord Qin, there's no need to make a fuss. I'm standing here talking to you in a friendly manner. I don't want to do anything to you. Isn't this already expressing my sincerity? Sincerity my asteriskis." At this moment, Qin Di really wanted to curse in his heart. But in the end he did not say it out loud. Just think about it. Since the other party is standing there, doesn't that mean that they have already thought about all kinds of reactions I will have? And if I were to scream now, what kind of consequences would it bring? Chen Di, who would never put himself in danger, forced himself to calm down. In order to ease his nervousness and the fear in his heart, he purposely used words to calm the other party down. "For you, why would he appear here? Could it be that you're not afraid that if I casually shout, the guards in the mansion will kill you?" No, no, no. Although he kept denying it, he was not nervous at all. The black shadow said, "Lord Qin is a smart man. Since he is smart, he will not seek death for no reason. Am I right?" This. Chen Di sucked in a breath of cold air and sighed in his heart. Sure enough, the other party already has the idea of killing me. Otherwise, he wouldn't make such a threat. If he wasn't prepared, he wouldn't be so relaxed. He lamented in his heart that he was still smart enough not to scream out loud. But at the same time, he had some guesses about the identity of the person who came. Someone would suddenly appear in front of him when the mansion was under siege. It seemed that he could guess who sent this person even if he used his toes to think. "You're a loyal man? Impressive. Lord Qin is indeed Lord Qin. You're also the smartest person in the Qin family. You guessed my identity so quickly. I wonder if you're interested in my arrival?" The black shadow chuckled. His tone was full of admiration. "That shouldn't be a problem, right? Who else could appear here at this moment other than you all? I'm just curious. This is my mansion. I've been running this place for many years. Those who can get close to this study are all people I trust. So why are you here? Do you mind telling me who's secretly helping you?" Chen Di seemed to be curious, but in fact he was testing the Black Shadow. It seemed that he wanted to get the answer he wanted from the Black Shadow. Another chuckle was heard. The Black Shadow continued, "All right, Lord Qin. You're a smart person, but don't think that others are fools. Do you think that I would casually reveal such a secret? Of course, you can understand it as money makes the world go round. Some people seem sincere, but it's only because they don't have enough bargaining chips to betray you. After all, as long as you have money, there are very few people and things in this world that can be rejected. Don't you agree?" Qin Di was speechless. Indeed, in this world, although money wasn't everything, it was still very useful in some things. For example, if you bribed your subordinates, some people would still betray you even if you used money. After all, Jiaoji was considered a feudal dynasty. In such a dynasty, people were divided into classes. Since there were classes, there would be unfairness. Some people had more money and power, while others had less. For those who had very little, when a large sum of money appeared, how many people would be able to refuse it? Knowing that there was no point in dwelling on this matter, Qin Di adjusted his mood and said, "All right, I won't ask this question. But since you suddenly appeared here, and in such a manner, I'm sure you have something that you need my help with. If that's the case, you may speak. Of course, I still want to remind you that before you speak, it's best to assess the situation in front of you. If your request is too excessive, I only need to shout outside and countless people will immediately rush in to take your life." Even at this time, Qin Di still didn't forget to threaten the other party. Or rather, he wanted to take the initiative in this matter. It had to be said that he was indeed a smart person. At least he knew how to use his advantage to do things. Unfortunately, this time, Qin Di was facing the Security Bureau's External Affairs team leader, Yang. This person was highly valued by Deputy Director Yang Chendong. At the same time, Yang Chendong had met him many times in private and even instructed him to teach many things. He wouldn't take such a threat seriously at all. As a member of the Security Bureau, they had always believed in a maxim, that is, wealth comes from danger. Many times, in order to complete a task, not only did they need to do a lot of foreshadowing before doing it, but they also needed to risk their lives at the last moment. Putting themselves in danger, going into the tiger's den, going to the tiger's den, and so on, these were all necessary experiences. For these senior agents of the Security Bureau who had long disregarded life and death and only had tasks and missions in their eyes, they weren't even afraid of death, so why would they be afraid of Qin Di's verbal threats? What's more, if Qin Di really shouted here, the first one to die would be the one who shouted. Therefore, in the face of Qin Di's obviously weak voice, Yang continued to laugh and said, "No. I said before that Master Qin is a smart person. You won't do such meaningless things. The most important thing is that if you shout, you will lose your life first, right? And there's no point in doing so. If you die, perhaps many people will be secretly happy. It will even be a shame for the entire Qin family. After all, who knows if we're fighting among ourselves because of the unequal sharing?" After Yang completely pointed out the matter, Qin Di's face became very ugly. He suddenly realized that the other party was a devil. The other party had already thought of everything. Compared to him, who was suddenly faced with such a predicament, there were too many factors that he didn't consider. Just as Yang said, Qin Di might not be afraid of death and could even shout loudly to attract the servants in the mansion, but in this way, not only would he die, but he might also die in a very stupid way. If others really thought that he was colluding with a foreign country and died because of the unequal sharing, wouldn't it cause trouble for the entire Qin family? Chen family was the second largest surname in Jiaoji, second only to Ruan family. They were even stronger than the current Li family of the king. But unfortunately, 10 years ago, Chen Heijin had a disagreement with the family and announced his departure from the Qin family and had begun to decline. Although he still had some influence among the civil officials, and it couldn't even be considered small. But there wasn't a single person in the military who could make a move. If a family could only control some public opinion and didn't have an effective military to support them, one could imagine how many restrictions they would face when doing things. Take Qin Di for example. Although he had some ability, was quite smart, and had the position of a court official, he could only be confined to this small piece of land in Shiyu City. This was the disadvantage of not having military power. Without anyone to support him, his words carried less and less weight. The entire Chen family's status in society became lower and lower, to the point that they were about to fall from being the second largest family. When that time came, there would be many people who would be willing to step on them. At that time, it would be the greatest test for the entire Chen family. Fortunately, a war suddenly broke out, and then the mercenaries came. After that, some of the actions against the Chen family disappeared. Of course, this didn't mean that those people had given up on the idea of sharing the benefits of the Chen family. Instead, when an even greater enemy appeared, everyone automatically ignored their threat and existence. Chapter 529. From a certain point of view, the appearance of the mercenaries had temporarily saved the Chen clan. At the very least, it gave them a chance to deal with the situation. Of course, if the mercenaries retreated, then it wouldn't be long before the Chen clan would still face heavy pressure and danger. It was precisely because she had understood all of this that Yonk had sought out Chen Di instead of the other important ministers of Jiaoji. From their analysis, the Chen clan was the most likely to bow to the mercenaries. From a certain point of view, they had a common enemy, didn't they? Seeing that Chen Di was speechless, Skylark smiled like a winner and said, "Well, Lord Chen, you don't have to think too much. To be honest, I'm here to save you, don't you think so?" As soon as he said this, Chen Di knew that the other party had investigated him thoroughly. Under such circumstances, there was no point in saying anything else. He sighed and said, "All right, then say what you want to say. Let's see if I can do it." Yonk knew that Chen Di had come to the main topic. "It's very simple. When we attack the city tomorrow, we need your help. Our Duke of Loyalty said that no matter how strong a castle is, it's still afraid of being breached from the inside. You should understand what I mean. Of course, if you do this when the city is breached, the Chen clan's bloodline will be preserved. What do you think? Isn't this a fair deal?" Yonk directly said that he needed him to cause trouble in the city. Chen Di was already prepared for this. After all, if it wasn't for this point, Yonk wouldn't have taken the risk to appear in front of him at this time. However, he was dissatisfied that Yonk only said that the Chen clan's bloodline could be preserved and didn't say anything about settling them down. This was different from what he had expected. When one needed help, shouldn't one have to pay a great price? A simple sentence like this, asking him to betray Jiaoji for the Chen clan's survival, was clearly a little too low of a bargaining chip. Therefore, he continued to argue, "Isn't this a little unfair? I have to take such a huge risk, and even be cursed by the people of the world, and all I get in return is to stay alive. This, of course, you won't just be alive. You can also form an army of 10,000. Of course, this army can be led by your Chen family, but when something happens, you still have to listen to the mercenaries. Yes, this is already the greatest concession we can make. You should know that with the powerful firepower of the mercenaries, even if you don't do this, Shiyu City will still be destroyed. At that time, the Chen clan won't even be able to survive. This isn't something Lord Chen wants to see, right?" Chen Di originally wanted to have a good talk, but when he heard about the powerful firepower of the mercenaries, his whole face turned ugly. Then he thought about how powerful the enemy they were facing this time was. Even if I don't contribute, it's only a matter of time before Shiyu City falls. When that time comes, will he blame himself for giving up the opportunity in front of him? Once his clansmen knew that there was a chance of survival in front of them, but he didn't fight for it, those people would definitely tear him apart. This was not a fair negotiation to begin with. Chen Di had too few chips in his hands. In the face of Yun Kei's threats and temptations, he quickly surrendered and had no choice but to agree to the other party's request. As for whether this would be dangerous or not, what kind of joke was this? If the city fell, would he not be in danger? Not to mention, if Chen Di didn't agree, he would probably die tonight. The night continued, but some people's mentality had already changed. After agreeing to Yun Kei's request, the two of them began to discuss the next day's battle. It was easy to imagine that with such a malignant tumor in the Jiaoji kingdom, which was already riddled with holes, the speed at which it fell apart would only become faster. The sky would eventually brighten. When time slowly passed and the Grand Supreme also hung up in the sky, a war that would destroy the kingdom was slowly unfolding. The weather today was good. The drizzle from before had long disappeared. The sun hung high in the sky, giving people a feeling of being roasted. It was as if it would make people sweat unknowingly. Of course, whether the sweat was really because of the hot weather or because of fear and nervousness depended on one's perspective. It was almost noon, but there was still no movement from the Jiaoji army in Shiyu City. This seemed to indicate their attitude. Yang Chendong, who was already mentally prepared, first ordered the army to start cooking. After lunch, when there was still 15 minutes to noon, the mercenaries started to move. They slowly approached the East Gate Tower of Shiyu City. About 3 li outside the East Gate of Shiyu City, a huge dying temple made up of about 5,000 heads was standing there. This was left behind by the Jiaoji soldiers in yesterday's battle. They left behind 6,000 to 7,000 corpses. Among them, other than a few who were shot in the vitals and had their heads smashed, the rest of the dead soldiers' heads were collected and piled up into this capital. 5,000 heads piled up was already a very majestic sight. In addition, the materials were still very fresh. From time to time, fresh blood would flow out from the heads. From afar, it gave people a very terrifying feeling. This was Yang Chendong's psychological tactic. Furthermore, it was the Jiaoji man named Mo Tuo who tried to assassinate him. No matter what he did now, no one would be able to say anything about it. There was a saying, the greater good is on his side. Although the capital was terrifying, it was only a method to affect the morale of the enemy. In order to win on the battlefield, one had to rely on strong military strength. In this aspect, the mercenaries were naturally strong. Just like now, at the front of the troops outside the city was naturally the main force of the Lung Feng's 3rd Battalion. There were 4 battalions of 400 Lung Feng soldiers wielding the 95 style. To his left and right were 7 auxiliary battalions. 2,800 soldiers in camouflage uniforms without any military ranks held Type 81 rifles in their hands. They were like lions trying to catch a rabbit, ready to pounce at any moment. Behind the auxiliary battalions were 18,000 Jiaoji mercenaries. They were all wearing the Jiaoji army uniform. The only difference was that each of them had a white towel of the same color on their right arm. This was used to differentiate them from the Jiaoji soldiers in the city. Behind the Jiaoji mercenaries were the 7 auxiliary battalions. Each of them held a steel blade or a spear in their hands. Their movements were uniform. Their existence was to tie up the loose ends and prevent the Jiaoji mercenaries from betraying them. Although anyone with a discerning eye could see that Jiaoji was on the losing side, anything could happen before a conclusion was reached. One shouldn't have the intention to harm others, but one should always be wary of others. Behind the 3,000 temporary auxiliary soldiers, there were many figures in military green camouflage uniforms. There weren't many of them, only 100 or so. However, those who were familiar with the mercenaries knew that this was the core of the troop. In fact, this was also where Yang Chendong was at. Beside him, there was a platoon of Lung Feng soldiers, Wolf Fong Special Forces, Ghost Sniper Team, and the 1st and 2nd Guard Squads. The battle was about to begin, but Yang Chendong didn't look at the situation in front of him. Instead, he squatted down and stroked a few pieces of military green metal equipment as if he was caressing a beautiful woman. If there were soldiers from later generations who could see this scene, they would definitely shout out, "This is a mortar." That's right, it was a mortar. Yang Chendong thought for a long time last night. In the end, he rejected the idea of taking out the huge cannons from the warehouse. However, he didn't do nothing. He still took out a new weapon like the mortar for today's battle. Since he had the warehouse in his hands, wouldn't it be a waste if he didn't make good use of the things inside? Whether it was the Lung Feng soldiers, auxiliary soldiers, or even temporary auxiliary soldiers, it wasn't easy to nurture these future Lung Feng soldiers. If he had the ability to make them sacrifice less, he wouldn't be stingy with taking out more things. The mortar was what he prepared. The mortar was a type of curved smoothbore cannon with a short body, a large angle of fire, and a high trajectory arc. It was loaded from the muzzle and fired a projectile with a tail fin. It was loaded from the muzzle and fired in a curved manner. The cannon was short, had a short range, and was light and flexible. It could shoot targets behind cover. Since the invention of the mortar, it had always been an effective suppressive weapon to support and accompany infantry in combat. It was an extremely important conventional weapon for infantry. And Yang Chendong took out the 100mm mortar used by the active Chinese regiments. The 100mm mortar used by the active Chinese regiments was the caliber of the mortar. The total weight was about 100 kilograms, the maximum range was 8,000 meters, and the effective killing radius was about 20 meters. This type of mortar wasn't the largest caliber, nor was it the smallest. The weight of 200 kilograms wasn't too heavy. At least a few people could easily lift it up. Early in the morning, when the 5 mortars appeared in Yang Chendong's tent, only Tiger's Mane and Beta Persei were surprised. Fortunately, they had seen this kind of thing many times before. Since the young master didn't explain it to them, they naturally didn't ask anything. As for the others, when they saw that Tiger's Mane and Beta Persei didn't show the slightest surprise, they didn't ask. They all thought that this was originally arranged by the 6th young master. Yang Chendong could feel a trace of confusion in Tiger's Mane and Beta Persei's eyes, but he didn't explain. Didn't they all think of him as a god? Then he would continue to be one. In fact, he really didn't know how to explain anything. You're tuning in to the Wang Lin's Journey YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.